The night I learned how quiet the woods can become. It wasn't peaceful. It was wrong. No wind, no insects. Just a silence so heavy, it felt like something was listening back. I remember lying in my tent, staring at the fabric inches from my face, realizing the forest had stopped breathing. Every story you're about to hear is 100% true. Verified through public records, documented reports, and first-hand witness accounts. Some names have been changed to protect privacy, but the events themselves are completely real and deeply unsettling. If this kind of true horror pulls you in, tap like. It helps these stories reach more horror lovers like you. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. You're part of my horror family, and I want to know where my family is listening from. And after watching, tell me which story hit you the hardest. Finally, subscribe. It fuels this channel and helps bring even more true, terrifying stories to light. I went up into the state forest because I needed quiet, in the kind of way that makes you feel guilty for wanting it. Back home, every street light and neighbor's porch had started to feel like an accusation. People knew my schedule, knew my face, knew the version of my life that had come apart. I'd been sleeping in short bursts, waking with my jaw clenched and my hands numb. So when a co-worker mentioned a stretch of forest up in the Appalachians where you could hike in and camp without seeing anyone for days, I latched onto it like a rope. It was late October, the time of year when the mountains smell like wet leaves and wood smoke, and the first hints of rot. The drive up was long and grey. The road narrowed into a twisting ribbon with guardrails bent from old wrecks. Fog sat in the hollows and slid up the ridgelines like a slow tide. I passed a town sign that said Mason Hollow, and then another that looked older, half swallowed by vines, like the forest was trying to take it back. I parked at a small gravel lot beside a trailhead. No other cars, no cell service. The air was cold enough to sting my lungs. Somewhere deep in the trees, a crow called once and then went quiet. The hike in was longer than I expected, the kind that turns your thoughts down to simple things: breath, footing, the weight of your pack. The trail climbed and dipped through hardwoods, over slick roots and mud that clung to my boots like it didn't want to let go. The forest felt too still, not dead exactly, just waiting. By late afternoon, I found a flat spot near a shallow creek tucked into a small hollow where the hills leaned inward. The water moved over stones with a soft, constant sound that made the silence feel less absolute. I set up my tent under a canopy of bare branches, the nylon snapping in the cold. The ground smelled damp and earthy, like mushrooms and wet bark. A few yards away was an old fire ring, stones blackened by soot, half sunk into the soil. Someone had been there before, not recently, but not long enough ago to feel historical either. When I knelt to clear leaves for my sleeping pad, I noticed something strange. A single boot print pressed into the mud near the creek's edge. It wasn't mine. The tread pattern was different, deeper, like the person had stood there for a while. I looked around, expecting to see more. There wasn't anything else. No trail of prints, no scuffed leaves. Just that one impression like a punctuation mark. I told myself it was old. The creek bank held footprints the way it held everything. Pressed, preserved, softened by time. As dusk settled, the temperature dropped fast. Fog rolled into the hollow, thin at first, then thicker, gathering low like breath from the earth. It made the trees look farther away than they were. My headlamp beam turned the mist into floating dust. I ate a packaged meal sitting on a log and listened to the forest. Somewhere off to the right, something moved through leaves, probably a deer. Then farther off, a coyote called. It was answered by another, then another, voices bouncing across the hills. By the time I crawled into the tent, I felt that familiar relief, like I'd finally stepped outside the reach of everyone else's expectations. The tent smelled like nylon and the faint metallic tang of my stove fuel. I put my boots inside the vestibule area, right by the zipper, because I didn't want spiders in them and because the ground was wet enough that leaving them outside felt like inviting misery. I turned off my headlamp and lay there, listening to the creek. That was when I heard the footsteps. At first, it was easy to dismiss. A raccoon, a deer, wind shifting branches. But it wasn't random. It had rhythm. Crunch, pause, crunch, pause. Slow, deliberate steps moving around the tent in a wide circle. My body went still in the way it does when your brain is trying to decide if fear is reasonable. I held my breath and listened harder. The sound moved from one side of the tent to the other, then behind me, then back toward the front. I unzipped the tent an inch, just enough to see out. My headlamp beam cut into fog and caught nothing. No eye shine, no shape, no shadow, just wet leaves and tree trunks stripped bare. I listened again. The steps had stopped. I waited a full minute, jaw tight, trying to convince myself I was spooking myself over nothing. Then the steps started again. Closer this time. The nylon wall of my tent trembled slightly, as if something had brushed it. Not hard enough to leave a mark, just enough to be undeniable. I unzipped faster and shone my light in a wide arc, sweeping the trees. Nothing. The fog swallowed the beam after a few yards. The creek sounded louder now, like it was trying to cover the silence. I crawled back in and zipped the tent shut, hands shaking. My brain kept offering explanations like a desperate salesman. Deer, raccoon, someone else camping nearby. But I hadn't seen another tent. I hadn't seen another car. The footsteps continued for what felt like an hour, circling, pausing, circling again. Each time I reached for the zipper, they stopped. Like whatever it was knew exactly when I moved. Eventually, exhaustion won. I must have slept because the next thing I remember is gray morning light filtering through the tent fabric and the fog, thinning into pale ribbons. My mouth tasted like stale fear. I sat up stiff and reached down for my boots. My hand met cold nylon. Empty. I froze and turned slowly, checking the corners of the tent like the boots might have rolled away. They weren't inside. My heartbeat thudded in my ears as I unzipped the front and looked out. Both boots sat neatly on the damp ground just outside the tent flap. Side by side, laces tucked, toes pointing directly toward the trail that led back out of the hollow. For a second I couldn't move, because I knew, absolutely knew, I'd put them inside, and because the way they'd been placed didn't feel like an animal rummaging. It felt careful, like someone had taken their time, like someone had been waiting for me to notice. I didn't put the boots back on right away. I just stared at them, trying to make my brain accept what my eyes were showing me. The fog had lifted enough that I could see farther into the trees, but the light was still flat and gray, the kind that makes everything look lifeless. The ground around my tent was damp and dark, leaves stuck to the nylon. The creek ran steady Indifferent. I stepped out in my socks and looked for tracks. There should have been something. Heel marks, crushed leaves, mud smears. The soil near the tent was soft from the night's moisture. If a person had walked there, it would hold the evidence. But there was nothing. No prints circling my tent. No scuffs. No broken twigs. Just my own footprints from the night before, and the shallow dents where my boots sat like they had been placed on a table. It made my skin crawl in a different way than obvious danger does. It wasn't someone is here. It was someone was here. And you can't prove it. I slipped my boots on with hands that felt clumsy, laces shaking. The leather was damp and cold, like they'd been in the open air for a long time. I told myself it was just dew, just condensation. But the laces were tucked neatly the way I never bothered to tuck them, especially when I was tired. I packed faster than I had planned, movements stiff and mechanical. Every zip sounded too loud. Every buckle click echoed. I kept turning my head, expecting to see a figure standing behind a tree or a face in the fog. Nothing. Still, the quiet felt wrong now, like the forest wasn't peaceful, just withholding. When I lifted my sleeping bag, something fell out from beneath it and landed on the tent floor with a soft, papery sound. I froze, then reached down slowly and picked it up. It was a photograph, not mine, not anything I'd packed. A small, creased, faded photo like something from a cheap, disposable camera. The edges were soft, as if it had been handled a lot. The picture showed a campsite in the woods, an old tent, a fire ring, and a man sitting on a log with his back to the camera. Fog in the background, trees bare. The man's posture looked familiar. The jacket looked like mine. At first, I thought it was a coincidence. The forest is full of people who dress the same. Then I noticed something on the back of the photo. Faint pencil writing, pressed hard enough to leave grooves. "Don't sleep here." My throat tightened. I turned the photo over again and stared at it, as if the image would change if I looked long enough. The tent in the photo wasn't my tent, but the angle was almost identical. The creek bend in the background looked the same. The fire ring. My fire ring. I felt that prickling sensation along my arms. The one you get when your body decides you're in danger before your mind can explain why. My first thought was simple and humiliating. How long have I been watched? I stuffed the photo into my pocket without thinking and forced myself to finish packing. When I stepped onto the trail, the woods felt tighter. The trees stood closer together, trunks slick with moisture. The ground was a patchwork of mud and decaying leaves. Everything smelled like wet bark and cold soil. Somewhere above, a branch creaked in the wind, and I flinched hard enough to make my neck ache. A quarter mile in, I noticed something that made me stop. A strip of fabric tied to a branch at shoulder height, bright or orange, like survey tape, fluttering slightly. It didn't belong. There weren't trail markers like that here. The state forest used blazes on trees, small and faded. I walked closer and realized it wasn't survey tape. It was a shoelace. Not just any shoelace, one of mine. The frayed end, the dark stain near the aglet where I'd spilled coffee weeks ago. Tied in a neat bow around the branch like a decoration. My stomach turned cold. I reached down and looked at my boot. One lace was missing. I hadn't noticed, because whoever had done it cleanly, quietly, without waking me. I stood there in the middle of the trail, staring at that lace fluttering in the breeze, and the fear I felt then wasn't a spike. It was something heavier, a realization settling into my chest like a stone. This wasn't random. This wasn't an animal. Someone had been close enough to touch my boots, open the tent vestibule, take a lace, leave a photo. Someone had done it without leaving tracks. Or worse, someone had known how to move without making the forest show it. I kept walking, faster now. The trail wound through a rhododendron thicket where the branches formed a tunnel. The light dimmed under the evergreen leaves. The air smelled sharp and green, like crushed plants and damp stone. My breathing sounded loud in my ears. Then I heard it again. Crunch, pause, crunch, footsteps behind me. Not running, not rushing, matching my pace from a distance. I stopped. The sound stopped. I waited, not turning, trying to listen for breathing, for leaf movement, for anything. My heart hammered. Nothing. I took 3 steps. Crunch. Pause. Crunch. I turned fast, swinging my headlamp beam back down the trail. Fog drifted between the trunks. The path behind me was empty. But on the ground, in a soft patch of mud, was a single boot print. Deep, clean. Not mine. The same kind of punctuation mark I'd seen by the creek. I didn't run. Not because I was brave, but because running in the mountains gets you hurt. Twisted ankles, broken wrists. Panic makes you careless. I kept walking fast, controlled, swallowing the urge to bolt. When I finally reached the gravel lot, my truck sat alone, exactly where I'd left it. The air smelled like cold rock and wet leaves. My hands shook so badly, I fumbled the keys twice. Before I got in, I looked back at the tree line. The forest stood there silent and thick. Fog hung low between the trunks like smoke. No movement, no figure, no proof, just the sense of eyes. I drove down out of the mountains with my shoulders tight and my jaw clenched until it hurt. The farther I got, the more normal the world became. Houses, mailboxes, a gas station with bright lights. And still, the fear stayed with me. Not as adrenaline, but as something sticky that didn't wash off. Later, when I tried to explain it to a friend, the words sounded thin. My boots moved. A photo showed up. A lace was tied to a branch. It sounded like a campfire story. Like something you tell for attention. So I stopped telling it. But some nights, when rain hits my windows and the air goes heavy, I wake with my hands curled like fists, nails digging into my palms. I'll sit there in the dark and smell damp earth in my imagination. Wet leaves, creek water, rot under the sweet. And I'll think about those boots placed neatly outside my tent, toes pointing toward the trail like directions, like a warning, or like someone reminding me that in the mountains, the difference between being alone and being isolated is sometimes just one quiet person you never see. And the worst part is still this. I don't know if the forest was trying to tell me to leave, or if it was letting me go. I kept checking the tree line, half expecting to see someone standing there again in daylight. Nothing. As we drove out, the fog thinned on the ridge. Sunlight broke through in pale strips. The world started to look normal. Cars on the road, houses with laundry on porches, a diner sign flickering to life. Lily fell asleep in the passenger seat, her head against the window, breath fogging the glass in small clouds. For a moment, I watched that fog gather and disappear and thought about those heel marks. How they were pressed into damp earth like someone had been patient enough to stand there and listen to us breathe. I reported it later, not in a dramatic way. Just a call to the ranger station, a description of prints, a cigarette butt, the old missing poster. The man on the phone sounded tired. He said they'd make a note. He said campers see things sometimes. Maybe he was right. Maybe the woods are full of misread shadows and overactive imaginations. But I keep coming back to one detail years later, when Lily is older and still refuses to camp. Those heel marks were too deep to be accidental. Someone stood there long enough to sink into the dirt, and they stood still, quiet as the trees, close enough to watch my daughter whisper into the dark. The horror isn't that I couldn't protect her. It's that I told her it was nothing. And for the rest of my life, I'll wonder what would have happened if she hadn't woken up. And if that person had decided not to stay in the shadows, somewhere in the woods, an owl called once, then nothing. I started to drift, my mind finally loosening its grip. Then Lily's hand found my arm in the dark, tight. "Dad," she whispered, barely audible. "Someone's standing out there." I was halfway asleep, and for a second I didn't understand. My eyes opened to darkness. The tent was dim, just the faint outline of nylon and our gear piled near the entrance. "What?" I whispered. "Between the trees," she said, "right there, watching." I held my breath and listened. Nothing. No footsteps, no leaves rustling, no branch snap, just the soft hiss of wind through needles high above. I wanted to tell her she was imagining it, that shadows play tricks in the dark, that it was nothing. I needed it to be nothing, because the alternative meant I'd brought my daughters into something I couldn't control. "It's just the trees," I said quietly. "Your eyes are adjusting." Lily didn't answer. Her fingers stayed clenched around my sleeve. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on. The beam cut through the tent mesh and into the woods beyond our sight. It lit up wet leaves, a tree trunk, the edge of the picnic table. The fog made the light look thicker, like it was pushing through milk. There was no one there. I swept the beam left and right, slower, forcing my breathing to stay steady. Nothing. When I turned the light off, the darkness rushed back. The fog outside seemed to press closer, and I realized my heart was beating too hard for a man trying to reassure his kid. Lily whispered, "It moved." I didn't know what to say to that, so I did what parents do when they're scared. I lied with confidence. "Go to sleep," I said, voice calm. "I'm right here." Eventually, Lily's grip loosened. Her breathing slowed. I lay awake for a long time, listening to the woods, waiting for a sound that would prove her wrong. I heard nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the campground wasn't empty, only quiet enough to hide whoever was there. Setup and suspicion. I promised my daughter her first camping trip would feel like a story she could tell at school. Fireflies, marshmallows, and the kind of quiet that makes you sleep hard. I was lying to both of us, but not on purpose. The truth is, I needed the trip as much as she did. The year before had been a long string of court dates, paperwork, and strained conversations spoken through clenched teeth. I'd gotten custody on weekends, and I'd spent most of those weekends trying too hard. Museums, movies, anything that looked like proof I was doing this right. Camping felt simpler, honest. Just the two of us, a tent, and a couple nights in the mountains where nobody cared about my past. We drove up into the Appalachians on a Friday after school. The highway narrowed into state roads and then into a two-lane county route that twisted through hollows where fog sat low even in daylight. Every few miles there was a faded town sign. Ridgeway, Dry Creek, Mason Fork, names that sounded like they belonged to older versions of the world. The air changed as we climbed. It smelled like wet leaves and pine, and something faintly sour, rotting wood, maybe, or creek mud. The campground was called Briar Gap. It was one of those state-run places, with a cracked sign and a little booth that looked like it hadn't been staffed in years. The gravel loop road wound past empty sites with fire rings and picnic tables bleached gray. A few were overgrown with weeds. One had an old plastic chair tipped on its side like it had been abandoned in a hurry. We picked a spot near the edge of the loop because my daughter, Lily, liked the idea of being close to the woods. She'd been watching videos about camping and kept pointing out perfect tent places, like she was scouting. The site had a picnic table with carved initials in it and a fire ring full of soggy ash. The ground was hard-packed dirt, damp from recent rain. Beyond the clearing, the forest started immediately. Oak and hemlock, thick undergrowth, a slope dropping away into darker trees. I set up the tent while Lily gathered sticks like she'd seen in the videos. The nylon smelled new and plasticky. My hands smelled like metal from the poles. Somewhere nearby, a creek ran, but you couldn't see it, only hear it now and then. A soft thread of water hidden under leaves. As the sun went down, the temperature dropped fast. Setup and suspicion. I only agreed to the trip because I didn't trust myself to be alone. That's not something I said out loud at the time. Back then, I told people I needed fresh air, a reset, a weekend without screens. The truth was I'd been sleeping badly for months, waking up with my heart already racing, like I'd missed something important. Being around my two friends, Mason and Kira, kept my mind from circling the same dark thoughts. Mason picked the spot, a remote lake tucked into state forest land high in the Appalachians. The kind of place you only reach by taking a gravel road until it stops making sense and then hiking the last mile in. He called it quiet. Kira called it a dead zone. I called it anything that wasn't my apartment. We left late Friday and drove through mountain towns that looked half awake. Closed diners, faded signs, porch swings moving in wind with nobody in them. The road climbed and narrowed. Guardrails bent from old wrecks. Fog collecting in the hollows like it belonged there. Past a sign that said, Wolf Pen Gap. The world turned into wet trees and gray sky. We parked at a trailhead with one other car that looked like it hadn't moved in days. No one around it. The air smelled like rain and leaf rot. The woods were quiet in a way that made you listen harder. The hike in was muddy and slow. Rhododendron grew thick on both sides, branches arching overhead like a tunnel. We crossed a shallow creek on slick stones. Somewhere out in the trees, something big moved. Maybe a deer, maybe a bear. But we never saw it. Only heard leaves shift and then settle back into silence. When the lake finally opened up through the trees, it didn't look real at first. Water like dark glass, fog sitting low on it. The far shoreline softened until it might as well have been a painting. The hills rose around it in dull green and brown, and the air had that cold, damp smell lakes carry: mud, algae, and whetstone. We set camp on a small flat patch near the shore. It felt like the only place people ever used. There was an old fire ring made of blackened rocks, and a log that had been dragged into a makeshift bench. Someone had hammered a crooked nail into a tree and left a length of frayed rope hanging from it. Little signs of past weekends that didn't feel comforting. more like reminders that other people had stood here and stared at the same water. As the sun dropped behind the hills, the temperature fell fast. Kira gathered sticks, Mason got the fire going, and I tried to settle into the simple rhythm of camping. Hands busy, mind quieter. The fire crackled, smoke clinging low because the air was wet. Across the lake, the far shore was still just a dark line under fog. Probably just shadows, I said, softer this time. You did good telling me. She nodded, but her face stayed serious in a way that didn't fit an 8-year-old on her first camping morning. She looked older for a second, and it made something twist in my chest. I unzipped the tent and stepped out into damp air that smelled like wet dirt and pine. The campground was still mostly empty. A couple sites down. There was a minivan with condensation on the windows, but no movement. No smoke from a fire. No voices. Only the woods and the faint, hidden sound of that creek. I walked to the edge of our site where Lily had pointed the night before. The dirt there was darker, packed down from rain. Leaves had stuck to it like wet paper. I scanned the ground without really expecting to find anything. More out of obligation to my own peace of mind than belief. And then I saw them. Deep heel marks pressed into the dirt right at the tree line. 2 impressions side by side, as if someone had stood there for a while, weight shifting slightly but not moving away. They were too evenly spaced, too symmetrical. Not like a deer, not like a raccoon, not like any animal that walks on 4 feet. Human heels. The toes weren't as clear, the front of the prints softened by damp soil and leaves, but the heels were undeniable, deep, rounded, deliberate. I crouched down slowly, the way you approach something fragile. My stomach went cold. The heel marks were close enough that whoever made them could have been looking straight into our tent. I glanced back at the campsite. Lily was still inside, rummaging in her bag. The tent looked small, vulnerable. My first instinct was to cover it up, to smooth the dirt, erase the marks, keep this from becoming a thing she carried. But I couldn't move. I stayed crouched there, with my hands on my knees, staring at those impressions and replaying her whisper. Someone standing out there. She hadn't been imagining it. I stood and walked the perimeter, trying to find a trail of prints leading away. There should have been something. Steps into the woods, disturbed leaves, broken twigs. The ground was wet enough to show it. But after a few feet, the evidence stopped. No clear footprints going deeper. No path back toward the campground road. Just those 2 heel marks at the edge of our site like punctuation. Like someone had come close, stood still, and then vanished back into the dark without leaving a story. I forced myself to act normal. I made breakfast on the camp stove. I smiled too much. Lily ate her oatmeal and kept glancing at the trees. Not with fear, exactly, but with the kind of caution kids develop when an adult tells them they're safe and reality disagrees. After breakfast, we walked to the restroom again. I told myself I just needed to use it. The truth is, I wanted to see if anyone else was around. If I could make the night make sense by seeing a normal camper, a family, a guy with a fishing pole. The bulletin board was still there, sagging under layers of damp paper. I looked at the missing poster again. In the daylight, I could make out more. A child's face, a date, a sheriff's office number in faded ink. The name was smudged, but the age looked close to Lily's. My throat tightened. I felt suddenly, vividly, that the campground wasn't just empty. It was a place where things had happened quietly enough that the woods kept them. On the way back, I noticed something else near our site. A cigarette butt crushed into the mud near the picnic table. Fresh, not waterlogged, and we didn't smoke. I stood there staring at it until Lily asked, "Are we going hiking today?" I looked at her face, small, earnest, trusting, and the guilt hit me hard, sharp and clean. I'd brought her here because I wanted to feel like a good father. Because I wanted a memory that didn't involve courtrooms and strained weekends. Instead, I'd given her a night where she watched the dark and knew I was wrong. "We're going home," I said. Her eyebrows lifted. "But we just got here." "I know," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Sometimes you can change plans. It's okay." She didn't argue. That's what scares me now. How quickly she accepted it, like part of her was relieved. We packed up fast. The tent went into its bag still damp. The sleeping bags smelled like smoke and gold fabric. Fog began to creep through the trees and settle low in the campground. It didn't roll like movie fog. It just appeared, filling the spaces between trunks like breath. The other side stayed empty. No headlights, no voices, no laughter. A few times we heard a car on the distant road, but it sounded far away, muffled by hills. We made a small fire. Lily roasted marshmallows and ended up with sticky hands and a grin that made me feel, for a moment, like maybe I hadn't ruined everything. The firelight flickered across her face and made the woods around us look deeper than they were. Every now and then, the darkness beyond the ring seemed to shift, but it was only shadows moving with flame. Later, when Lily went to the restroom with me, we walked past the campground bulletin board. Most of the flyers were weather-warped, a map of trails, a notice about bears, and beneath a layer of curled tape, a missing poster so faded you could barely make out the face. Just the suggestion of a smiling kid and a date from years ago. Lily tugged my sleeve. "Dad, what's that?" "Old," I said too quickly. "Probably hasn't been updated." But I stared at it longer than I meant to. The paper was sun-bleached and rain-stained, the corners eaten away, the name almost illegible. It made my stomach tighten, for reasons I couldn't explain without sounding paranoid. Back at the site, we climbed into the tent. The air inside warmed with our breath. Lily curled into her sleeping bag and asked if bears could unzip tents. I told her no. I told her the animals here were more scared of us than we were of them, which is mostly true. Until it isn't. Outside, the campground settled into silence. Not peaceful silence. The kind that feels like the world is holding still. At some point, the crickets stopped all at once. I noticed because Lily did. She shifted beside me and whispered, "Why did it get so quiet?" "Because it's late," I whispered back. "Go to sleep." The quiet stretched. The tent fabric moved gently in the breeze, making soft tapping sounds as it brushed the poles. Somewhere in the woods, an owl called once, then nothing. I started to drift, my mind finally loosening its grip. Then Lily's hand found my arm in the dark, tight. "Dad," she whispered, barely audible. "Someone's standing out there." I was halfway asleep, and for a second I didn't understand. My eyes opened to darkness. The tent was dim, just the faint outline of nylon, and our gear piled near the entrance. "What?" I whispered. "Between the trees," she said. "Right there, watching." I held my breath and listened. Nothing. No footsteps. No leaves rustling. No branch snap. Just the soft hiss of wind through needles high above. I wanted to tell her she was imagining it, that shadows play tricks in the dark, that it was nothing. I needed it to be nothing, because the alternative meant I'd brought my daughter into something I couldn't control. "It's just the trees," I said quietly. "Your eyes are adjusting." Lily didn't answer. Her fingers stayed clenched around my sleeve. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on. The beam cut through the tent mesh and into the woods beyond our sight. It lit up wet leaves, a tree trunk, the edge of the picnic table. The fog made the light look thicker, like it was pushing through milk. There was no one there. I swept the beam left and right, slower, forcing my breathing to stay steady. Nothing. When I turned the light off, the darkness rushed back. The fog outside seemed to press closer, and I realized my heart was beating too hard for a man trying to reassure his kid. Lily whispered, "It moved." I didn't know what to say to that, so I did what parents do when they're scared. I lied with confidence. "Go to sleep," I said, voice calm. "I'm right here." Eventually, Lily's grip loosened. Her breathing slowed. I lay awake for a long time, listening to the woods, waiting for a sound that would prove her wrong. I heard nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the campground wasn't empty, only quiet enough to hide whoever was there. Chapter 2. Discovery and Impact. Morning came thin and gray, the kind of light that makes everything look tired. Fog still sat between the trees. The fire ring was cold. My back ached from sleeping on hard ground. Lily stirred and blinked up at me, like she'd forgotten the night, until her eyes shifted toward the tent wall. "Was it real?" she asked. I swallowed. My mouth was dry. It was. That's when Mason nudged my shoulder and pointed with his chin. A second campfire burned on the opposite side. It was small but obvious. An orange glow pulsing through the trees, reflected on the water in a thin broken line. It wasn't close enough to hear voices, too far for details, just a fire. "Didn't think anyone else was out here," Kira said. Mason shrugged. "Maybe that car at the trailhead." I stared across the water longer than I meant to. The fire looked steady, tended. Not a brush fire, not a lantern, something controlled. We went back to our own fire and tried to act normal. Ate warmed up chili from a pot, passed around a cheap bottle of whiskey that tasted like gasoline in comfort. The fog thickened as night settled. The woods around us turned into a wall. At some point, I looked up again. The other fire was still there. It didn't bother me at first. In a weird way, it made the place feel less empty. But later, when our fire burned down to coals, and Mason said we should turn in, I noticed something that tightened in my chest. As we smothered our coals and crawled into tents, the fire across the lake dimmed, not gradually, not like it was simply burning out. It dimmed like someone had made a choice. A few minutes later, the glow vanished entirely. I lay in my sleeping bag listening to the lake lap softly at the shore. The fabric around me smelled like damp nylon and smoke. Somewhere out in the woods, an owl called once and then stopped. The silence that followed felt deliberate. In the morning, fog still hugged the water. Everything was damp. Our boots, our clothes, even the tent zippers. We made coffee on the small stove, the flame barely visible in the grey light. We could see the far shoreline better now. There was no smoke, no movement, no tent flashes, no bright tarp, no people walking, just trees and mist and the dark line of land. Mason tried to be casual about it. "They're probably tucked back in the woods. You wouldn't see much from here." Kira squinted across the lake. Then how'd we see their fire so clear? We spent the day hiking a short trail that looped above the water. Found old beer cans rusting into the leaves. A torn piece of blue tarp caught in a branch like a flag. We saw deer tracks in mud, but no human prints. No voices, no distant laughter. Nothing. That night the pattern repeated. We lit our fire, and across the lake, the other fire bloomed into life a few minutes later. Orange in the fog, perfectly placed in the same spot as before. It shouldn't have made me feel watched, but it did. Like someone was responding rather than coincidentally existing. When we let our fire die down, theirs dimmed. When we finally smothered ours and zipped up our tents, theirs went out. The timing was too neat, too polite. Later, lying awake, I listened harder than I should have. I could hear my own breathing, the soft rasp of Mason shifting in his tent, the lake's small sounds, and once, very faint, across the water, something like a single stick snapping. Then nothing. On the last morning, the sky was clearer. The fog lifted in patches, revealing the far shore in sharper detail. And still, there was no sign of anyone. No smoke column, no campsite colors, no movement between the trees. Just the memory of that fire, answering ours like a signal. Mason suggested we walk around the lake before hiking out. Just to satisfy curiosity, he said, trying to laugh it off. But his voice sounded tight. So we packed light, left most of our gear, and started around the shoreline. The woods felt different in daylight. Still damp, still quiet, but less forgiving. Every muddy patch made me look down for prints. Every snapped twig made me glance up. The trail wasn't really a trail, more like a deer path worn through brush. We pushed through rhododendron tunnels and climbed over fallen logs slick with moss. The ground smelled like wet leaves and decay. The whole time, the lake stayed beside us, dark and calm, reflecting the sky like it was holding something back. By the time we reached the far side, my shoulders were tight from tension I hadn't admitted to myself. We broke through the last line of trees and found the spot where the fire had been. The fire pit was there. I promised my daughter her first camping trip would feel like a story she could tell at school. Fireflies, marshmallows, and the kind of quiet that makes you sleep hard. I was lying to both of us, but not on purpose. The truth is, I needed the trip as much as she did. The year before had been a long string of court dates, paperwork, and strained conversations spoken through clenched teeth. I'd gotten custody on weekends, and I'd spent most of those weekends trying too hard. Museums, movies, anything that looked like proof I was doing this right. Camping felt simpler. Honest, just the two of us. A tent, and a couple nights in the mountains where nobody cared about my past. We drove up into the Appalachians on a Friday after school. The highway narrowed into state roads and then into a 2-lane county route that twisted through hollows where fog sat low even in daylight. Every few miles, there was a faded town sign, Ridgeway Dry Creek, Mason Fork. Names that sounded like they belonged to older versions of the world. The air changed as we climbed. It smelled like wet leaves and pine, and something faintly sour. Rotting wood maybe, or creek mud. The campground was called Briar Gap. It was one of those state-run places with a cracked sign and a little booth that looked like it hadn't been staffed in years. The gravel loop road wound past empty sites with fire rings and picnic tables bleached gray. A few were overgrown with weeds. One had an old plastic chair tipped on its side like it had been abandoned in a hurry. We picked a spot near the edge of the loop because my daughter, Lily, liked the idea of being close to the woods. She'd been watching videos about camping and kept pointing out perfect tent places, like she was scouting. The site had a picnic table with carved initials in it and a fire ring full of soggy ash. The ground was hard-packed dirt, damp from recent rain. Beyond the clearing, the forest started immediately. Oak and hemlock, thick undergrowth, a slope dropping away into darker trees. I set up the tent while Lily gathered sticks like she'd seen in the videos. The nylon smelled new and plasticky. My hands smelled like metal from the poles. Somewhere nearby, a creek ran, but you couldn't see it. Only hear it now and then. A soft thread of water hidden under leaves. As the sun went down, the temperature dropped fast. Fog began to creep through the trees and settle low in the campground. It didn't roll like movie fog. It just appeared, filling the spaces between trunks like breath. The other side stayed empty. No headlights, no voices, no laughter. A few times we heard a car on the distant road, but it sounded far away, muffled by hills. We made a small fire. Lily roasted marshmallows and ended up with sticky hands and a grin that made me feel, for a moment, like maybe I hadn't ruined everything. The firelight flickered across her face and made the woods around us look deeper than they were. Every now and then, the darkness beyond the ring seemed to shift, but it was only shadows moving with flame. Later, when Lily went to the restroom with me, we walked past the campground bulletin board. Most of the flyers were weather-warped. A map of trails, a notice about bears, and beneath a layer of curled tape, a missing poster so faded you could barely make out the face. Just the suggestion of a smiling kid and a date from years ago. Lily tugged my sleeve. "Dad, what's that?" "Old," I said too quickly. "Probably hasn't been updated." But I stared at it longer than I meant to. The paper was sun-bleached and rain-stained, the corners eaten away, the name almost illegible. It made my stomach tighten for reasons I couldn't explain without sounding paranoid. Back at the site, we climbed into the tent. The air inside warmed with our breath. Lily curled into her sleeping bag and asked if bears could unzip tents. I told her no. I told her the animals here were more scared of us than we were of them, which is mostly true until it isn't. Outside, the campground settled into silence. Not peaceful silence, the kind that feels like the world is holding still. At some point, the crickets stopped all at once. I noticed because Lily did. She shifted beside me and whispered, "Why did it get so quiet?" "Because it's late," I whispered back. "Go to sleep." The quiet stretched. The tent fabric moved gently in the breeze, making soft tapping sounds as it brushed the poles, ringed with stones. The ground around it was flattened, grass pressed down in an oval as if 2 or 3 people had slept there or sat there for hours. And the ashes inside the pit were still warm. Discovery and impact. I didn't want to put my hand near the ashes, but Mason did it without thinking. He crouched and hovered his palm over the center of the fire ring. His expression shifted from curiosity to something quieter. "It's warm," he said. Kira looked at me like she was waiting for me to say the sane thing, the reassuring thing. All I could do was stare at the blackened stones and the pressed grass around them. The flattened patch wasn't random. It had edges like a bed, like someone had laid out blankets and gotten up recently, but there were no footprints. That was the detail that made my stomach drop. The shoreline here was muddy, soft, perfect for holding a shoe tread. The ground near the fire pit was damp and dark. If someone had walked in from the woods, there should have been at least something. Heel marks, scuffs, a trail leading away. There was nothing. No prints near the water, no prints leading into the trees, no broken branches showing a recent path. It was as if the campfire and the pressed grass had been lowered into place and then left behind. Kira walked the perimeter slowly, eyes scanning the ground like she was doing inventory. "This doesn't make sense," she whispered, and I could hear the effort it took to keep her voice steady. Mason forced a laugh that didn't sound like him. "Maybe they came in from the ridge where it's rocky." But the ridge behind the campsite was covered in wet leaves and soft soil. I turned and looked at it, dense trees, undergrowth, shadowed pockets, even in daylight. There should have been disturbance. There wasn't. Then I noticed the other thing, the firewood pile. It was stacked neatly under a fallen log, bark side down like someone knew what they were doing. The wood looked fresh, cut clean, not snapped branches, not scavenged deadfall. Cut wood. I stepped closer and smelled it. Sapine, recent. My throat tightened. "Who brings cut wood out here?" Neither of them answered. I scanned the campsite again, hoping to see a tent tucked back, a hammock line, something that would make it normal. There was nothing. No trash, no cooler, no clothing, not even a forgotten bottle cap. Just the fire ring, the warm ash, the flattened grass, and that neat pile of wood. It felt staged, like a scene meant to be found. As we stood there, the lake behind us stayed unnaturally calm. No wind ripples, no birds landing. The air felt thick and damp, the smell of wet earth and smoke clinging to my clothes, even though we weren't near our own fire anymore. I realized then what had been bothering me since the first night. The other campfire wasn't comforting. It wasn't company. It was attention. We hadn't been sharing the lake. We'd been performing for someone. Kira crouched near the flattened grass and picked up something small between her fingers. She held it out, a cigarette butt, crushed but not wet, like it had been smoked undercover. The filter was stained dark, and the paper smelled faintly of cheap tobacco. Mason stared at it. "I didn't think anyone was allowed to smoke out here," he said, voice low. I didn't respond. My mind had gone to a place I didn't want to name. Someone close enough to watch us, close enough to mirror us, but careful enough not to leave any trace. I stepped toward the tree line, only a few paces, just far enough to see behind a thick rhododendron cluster. The woods there looked deeper than they should have, shadows stacked behind shadows. The leaves underfoot were damp but undisturbed, no broken stems, no dragged branches. I stopped because the air changed, cooler, like standing near a cellar door. The smell shifted from lake mud and smoke to something older, sourer. I backed away without taking another step. "That's enough," I said, and my voice cracked on the last word. "Let's go." Mason didn't argue. He looked pale, the kind of pale that comes from adrenaline and not enough sleep. Kira nodded quickly, like she'd been waiting for permission to be scared. We left the far campsite without touching anything else. The warm ash stayed behind us like a secret. The flattened grass looked like a body outline at a distance, and that thought made my skin prickle. On the way back around the lake, the woods felt louder, not with sound, but with presence. Every bird call sounded pointed. Every branch creak sounded like footsteps. At one spot where the path narrowed between water and brush, I glanced across the lake at our own campsite. From this angle, I could see the exact spot where our fire ring sat. It looked tiny and harmless, and I could see the opposite shore too. I could see how someone across the water could watch us easily, especially at night when our fire lit our faces.